History books overflow with tales of aerial combat during the Second World War, documenting the bravery of pilots who flew into hostile skies and the devastating impact of strategic bombing campaigns that reduced entire cities to rubble. These narratives focus on the clash between attackers and defenders high above the earth, where courage and technology collided in a struggle for air superiority. Yet there exists another dimension to this conflict, one that has been systematically overlooked in the decades since the war ended. This is the account of what transpired when the instruments of aerial defense, those massive guns pointed skyward in defiance of enemy aircraft, completed their trajectories and returned to the ground below. Consider the mathematics of aerial warfare. During any significant raid over a defended city, artillery crews would launch thousands upon thousands of shells into the atmosphere. Each projectile represented an attempt to destroy incoming bombers before they could release their deadly cargo. The defenders fired with volume rather than precision, creating curtains of explosive force through which enemy aircraft had to navigate. But fundamental physics governed every single one of these projectiles. What ascended into the heavens inevitably descended back toward the surface. This created a secondary bombardment, one originating not from hostile forces, but from the defenders themselves. The phenomenon manifested across every theatre where air defence played a significant role. From the industrial cities of Germany to the island fortress of Britain, from the occupied territories of the Netherlands to the surprised American naval base at Pearl Harbor, communities discovered that protection from aerial attack came with an unexpected and terrible price. The shells that missed their targets, and the vast majority did miss, had to land somewhere. Fragments from those that detonated at altitude scattered across wide areas. Complete shells that failed to explode properly plummeted earthward with deadly momentum. All of this material fell upon the heads of the very populations these weapons were designed to shield. Documentation of this hazard exists in fragmentary form across numerous archives and personal accounts, yet it has never been assembled into a comprehensive understanding of the threat. Military historians tend to focus on the effectiveness of anti-aircraft systems in terms of aircraft destroyed or damaged, measuring success by the number of bombers that failed to complete their missions. The collateral consequences on the ground receive far less attention if they are mentioned at all. This gap in historical understanding means that generations have grown up with an incomplete picture of what aerial warfare meant for civilian populations. The technology behind these defensive systems developed rapidly during the interwar period and throughout the conflict itself. Engineers and military planners recognized that bombers posed an existential threat to industrial capacity and civilian morale. The solution they devised involved surrounding valuable targets with rings of artillery pieces specifically designed for engaging aircraft. These weapons differed significantly from traditional field artillery. They featured longer barrels for increased muzzle velocity, specialized sights for tracking fast-moving targets, and most importantly, shells equipped with timed fuses that would detonate at predetermined altitudes. Germany led the world in anti-aircraft technology during this period. Their engineers perfected the famous 88mm cannon, a weapon that would become legendary for its versatility and effectiveness. This gun could hurl a shell weighing approximately 9 kilograms to altitudes exceeding 8,000 meters. The shell itself contained a charge designed to fragment into hundreds of pieces upon detonation, creating a sphere of deadly metal through which bombers had to fly. German doctrine called for concentrated fire, with multiple batteries targeting the same aerial zone to maximize the probability of hits. The Germans went beyond just deploying guns. In their major cities, they constructed massive concrete towers specifically designed to serve as anti-aircraft fortresses. These flak towers, as they were known, dominated the urban landscape. The structures in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna rose over 40 meters high, with walls of reinforced concrete several meters thick. Each tower mounted multiple heavy guns on its roof, along with lighter rapid-fire weapons for engaging low-flying aircraft. The interior spaces served as bomb shelters capable of protecting thousands of civilians during raids. These towers represented total commitment to the concept of active air defence, transforming entire buildings into weapons platforms. Britain developed similar capabilities, though their approach differed in execution. Rather than massive towers, the British distributed their anti-aircraft batteries more widely, using mobile units that could be repositioned as threats evolved. They also invested heavily in radar technology, creating integrated systems that could detect incoming bombers at great distances and coordinate defensive fire more effectively. London bristled with guns during the Blitz, their crews firing night after night as German bombers sought to break British morale through sustained aerial assault. The United States entered the war with less developed air defense infrastructure, but rapidly expanded its capabilities. American forces deployed anti-aircraft units to protect key installations both at home and abroad. The guns that defended Pearl Harbor, though they failed to prevent the devastating Japanese attack, represented the beginning of massive American investment in this form of warfare. By war's end, American forces had deployed thousands of anti-aircraft batteries across multiple theaters, protecting everything from frontline positions to rear area supply depots. Soviet air defenses operated on the most massive scale of all. The defense of cities like Leningrad and Moscow involved thousands of guns firing millions of shells over the course of the war. Soviet doctrine emphasized quantity, accepting lower accuracy in exchange for overwhelming volume of fire. Their gunners learned through brutal experience, developing tactics through trial and error as German aircraft subjected Soviet cities to prolonged campaigns of destruction. All of these systems shared one characteristic. They launched enormous quantities of metal into the air with the expectation that most of it would not find its intended target. This was understood and accepted as necessary. What received far less consideration was the inevitable return of all that material to the earth below. The shells themselves were complex devices. Each contained a mechanical or electrical fuse calibrated to detonate after a specific time interval. Crews would adjust these fuses based on the estimated altitude of incoming bombers. When functioning correctly, the shell would explode near enemy aircraft, sending fragments tearing through aluminum skin, severing control cables, puncturing fuel tanks, or striking human beings. The explosion itself created a visible burst of black smoke, giving rise to the dark clouds that characterize photographs of bomber formations under fire. However, fuses were imperfect devices manufactured under wartime conditions. Many failed to function as designed. Some detonated prematurely, bursting shortly after leaving the barrel or at altitudes too low to threaten aircraft. Others failed to detonate at all, transforming the shell into an unpowered projectile that would fall until it struck something solid. Even successful detonations created debris that had to descend. The steel casing of the shell fragmented into irregular chunks of metal, each one retaining heat from the explosion and possessing sharp edges capable of inflicting terrible wounds. Physics dictated what happened next. The fragments and intact shells followed ballistic trajectories back toward the surface. They fell across areas spanning many square kilometers, distributed by winds and the vagaries of their initial trajectories. They struck rooftops and streets, penetrated windows and walls, landed in gardens and courtyards. Some remained embedded in structures, others ricocheted unpredictably. All of them represented potential for death or injury to anyone unfortunate enough to be in their path. The experience of being beneath this rain of steel varied depending on one's location and circumstances. Those inside sturdy shelters heard the impact as a constant metallic drumming on concrete and earth above their heads, a reminder that danger came from multiple directions. People caught in the open during raids faced a terrible choice between seeking cover from bombs and seeking cover from their own defences. Moving through streets during or immediately after an attack meant navigating an environment littered with hot metal fragments, any of which could cause serious injury. Buildings bore the scars of this phenomenon. Roofs across defended cities showed patterns of damage inconsistent with bombing. Small penetrations, dozens or hundreds per structure, marked where fragments had punched through tiles or metal sheeting. Windows shattered not from blast pressure, but from direct impacts by falling debris. Walls displayed pockmarks where larger pieces had struck with enough force to chip stone or brick. In severe cases, entire shells embedded themselves in structures, lodging in attics or crashing through multiple floors before coming to rest. The danger extended beyond the immediate physical threat. Unexploded shells represented bombs waiting to detonate. Each one contained enough explosive to demolish a room or start a major fire. They might rest unstable, their fuses damaged, but still potentially active. Moving them required expertise and courage. Civil defense organizations trained specialists in ordnance disposal, but the sheer volume of dewed shells overwhelmed their capacity. Many remained in place for days or weeks, cordoned off while awaiting disposal, displacing residents and disrupting normal activities. Fire presented another hazard. Fragments retained enough heat from their detonation to ignite combustible materials. They started fires in attics filled with old timber, in warehouses stocked with flammable goods, in shops and homes where they landed amid furniture and fabrics. These fires compounded the destruction from enemy bombing, forcing firefighters to battle blazes on multiple fronts simultaneously. In some instances, fires started by defensive shells caused more damage than the bombs they were meant to intercept. The psychological impact cut deeply. Civilian populations learned to live with threat from above in the form of enemy bombers. They understood this danger and accepted it as part of warfare, but realizing that their own defenses posed an additional lethal threat created more complex emotions. Pride in the determination to fight back mixed with fear of the consequences. The thunder of the guns provided reassurance that the city was not defenseless, yet that same thunder meant death raining from the sky, regardless of whether bombers were successfully engaged. Children absorbed these contradictions in ways adults could not fully anticipate. The generation that grew up during the war years experienced childhood fundamentally shaped by aerial bombardment. They learned to recognize sirens signaling incoming raids. They practiced hurrying to shelters. They grew accustomed to the sounds of war, the droning of engines, the crash of explosions, the staccato of anti-aircraft fire. In this environment, they developed their own relationship with the physical remnants of conflict. Shell fragments became objects of fascination. After raids, children would emerge to scour streets and yards for pieces of metal. These fragments served as tangible connections to the vast and terrifying events unfolding above their heads. Possessing them meant having participated, however marginally, in the great drama of war. Children traded fragments like currency, comparing sizes and weights. Some fragments still bore heat, making them particularly prized. The danger inherent in handling sharp, potentially contaminated metal seemed to register less than the desire to possess these artifacts. Adults understood the risks better, but often felt powerless to prevent this behavior. The fragments were everywhere, impossible to gather completely, and children would find them regardless of prohibitions. Some parents collected their own samples to prevent children from handling the most dangerous pieces. Others resigned themselves to supervising as best they could, checking that wounds from cuts were properly treated, ensuring that fragments were cool before being pocketed. This childhood experience left lasting impressions. Adults who lived through the war years often recalled fragment collecting as one of their most vivid memories. The activity represented a way of asserting control, however illusory, over circumstances that were fundamentally uncontrollable. It provided distraction from fear and deprivation. Most importantly, it created a sense of participation in events that otherwise rendered children entirely passive victims. Yet participation came with a price. Medical records from defended cities document numerous cases of children injured or killed by shell fragments. Some were struck directly by falling debris during raids. Others injured themselves handling fragments, suffering cuts that became infected or burns from pieces still hot from detonation. A few triggered unexploded ordnance, resulting in catastrophic injuries or death. These tragedies occurred across all combatant nations, an unspoken commonality in the experience of aerial warfare. The specific incidents that can be documented represent only a fraction of the total impact. Many injuries went unrecorded amid the chaos of wartime, treated by overwhelmed medical services and never formally catalogued. Deaths were sometimes attributed to enemy action rather than being specifically identified as caused by defensive fire. The true toll remains unknowable, buried in incomplete records and fading memories. Certain cases stand out for their irony or tragedy. The Pearl Harbor attack provides the most striking example of defensive fire causing mass civilian casualties. When Japanese aircraft struck the American naval base on December 7, 1941, the surprise was complete. American forces scrambled to respond, with anti-aircraft batteries opening fire as quickly as crews could man their guns. They fired with desperate intensity, determined to bring down as many attackers as possible. The naval base itself occupied a peninsula, with the city of Honolulu lying nearby. American shells fired at Japanese aircraft followed trajectories that carried them over civilian areas. Many failed to detonate at their intended altitudes. These shells fell into residential neighborhoods, detonating on impact or plowing through structures as duds. Fragments from shells that did detonate properly scattered across wide areas of the city. When casualties were tallied after the attack, investigators determined that 68 civilians had died in Honolulu. Of these, only a small number could be definitively attributed to Japanese bombs. The overwhelming majority had been killed or fatally wounded by American anti-aircraft fire. 48 deaths came directly from shells and fragments launched by American forces. Property damage showed similar patterns, with numerous buildings struck by American ordnance rather than Japanese bombs. This created an uncomfortable truth that received minimal attention in subsequent accounts of the attack. The narrative focused on Japanese treachery and the losses suffered by American military forces. Civilian casualties were acknowledged but rarely analyzed in detail. The fact that American defenses had killed more civilians than enemy action contradicted the desired story of heroic resistance against unprovoked aggression. It suggested that the cure might be as dangerous as the disease, a conclusion military authorities had no interest in promoting. German cities experienced this phenomenon repeatedly throughout the war. Berlin, as the capital and primary industrial center, received the most intense air defense infrastructure. Hundreds of guns ringed the city, firing thousands of shells during each major raid. British bombing campaigns targeted Berlin from August 1940 onward, with attacks increasing in frequency and intensity as the war progressed. Records maintained by German civil defense organizations provide unusually detailed documentation of damage from defensive fire. After each raid, officials compiled reports noting the location and cause of destruction. These reports distinguished between damage from enemy bombs and damage from German shells. The pattern revealed was troubling. During the early years of the air war, when British raids were relatively small and bombing accuracy was poor, German anti-aircraft fire frequently caused more damage than enemy bombs. The first British raid on Berlin occurred in August 1940. The attacking force was small, the bombing scattered and largely ineffective. Yet the German response was massive, with every available gun firing at the detected bombers. Reports from that night document more damage from German shells than from British bombs. In multiple districts, the only significant destruction came from German ordnance. Windows shattered from fragments. Roofs sustained damage from impacts. Citizens were wounded or killed not by enemy action, but by their own defenses. This pattern continued throughout 1940 and into 1941. As British raids grew larger and more concentrated, enemy bombs began causing the majority of destruction. But German shells still contributed significantly to overall damage. A raid on September 7, 1941, saw 57 German shells cause documented damage, with 10 failing to explode and embedding themselves in structures across the city. Earlier raids showed similar or worse results, with entire districts reporting damage exclusively from German anti-aircraft fire. Specific locations bore repeated impacts. The Tiergarten district, located near the center of Berlin, suffered regular damage from German shells. Its position beneath flight paths to key targets meant that guns fired intensively whenever bombers approached from certain directions. Shells that malfunctioned or were mistimed fell into this area, shattering the windows of government buildings, damaging monuments, and striking civilian housing. Similar problems affected Wedding, Zehlendorf, and other neighborhoods positioned beneath commonly used approach routes. German authorities recognized the problem but had limited options for addressing it. The shells themselves were manufactured under increasingly difficult conditions as the war progressed, with quality control suffering accordingly. Slave labor and forced workers with no motivation for careful workmanship assembled fuses and other components. Materials were substituted as shortages developed. Testing was abbreviated to speed production. All of these factors contributed to higher failure rates. Training for gun crews was similarly compromised. Early in the war, crews received thorough instruction and extensive practice. As casualties mounted and demands for manpower increased, training periods shortened. Replacement crews arrived at batteries with minimal preparation, learning through experience rather than systematic instruction. This inevitably led to more mistakes in fuse settings and fire control calculations, contributing to shells detonating at incorrect altitudes or not at all. The occupied Netherlands experienced particularly severe problems with defensive fire. The country occupied a strategic position on the approach routes to Germany's industrial heartland. Allied bombers flying to targets in the Ruhr or beyond had to cross Dutch territory, making the Netherlands a front line in the air war, despite being far from ground combat. German forces stationed extensive anti-aircraft defences throughout the country, transforming Dutch cities and countryside into battlefields for the air war. Dutch civilians found themselves trapped beneath this conflict. They had no influence over German defensive measures. They could not protest the placement of guns near their homes. They had no recourse when German shells damaged or destroyed their property. Yet they suffered the consequences of the massive volume of fire directed at Allied aircraft passing overhead. The scope of the problem in the Netherlands was remarkable. Nearly 1,200 municipalities maintained records of damage from German anti-aircraft fire. These records documented thousands of incidents spread across the entire country. Rural areas suffered as much as cities. Farms reported barns destroyed, livestock killed, crops damaged. Villages saw houses struck, shops demolished, public buildings damaged. Cities experienced all of these problems on a larger scale, with fragments and shells falling into densely populated neighborhoods. The German occupation authorities established a dedicated fund to compensate victims of this damage. The existence of such a fund represented tacit acknowledgement that defensive fire created significant civilian casualties and property destruction. The fund operated throughout the occupation, processing thousands of claims. Records of these claims provide the most comprehensive documentation available of the scope and impact of anti-aircraft defensive fire on civilian populations. Claims detailed the full spectrum of damage. Some described minor property damage, a few broken windows or holes in roofing. Others documented complete destruction of structures, with shells detonating inside buildings or large fragments crashing through multiple floors. Many claims sought compensation for injury or death, with families receiving payments after loved ones were struck by falling debris. The consistency and volume of claims made clear that this was not an occasional problem, but a systematic consequence of air defense operations. The quality of German ammunition in the Netherlands appears to have been particularly poor. Many shells failed to detonate at any altitude, falling to earth intact. These represented extreme danger, as they contained live explosives and often unstable fuses. Dutch civil defense authorities developed expertise in locating and marking unexploded shells, then coordinating with German ordnance disposal teams for eventual removal. The process took time, during which areas had to be cordoned off and residents evacuated or warned to avoid the location. British cities experienced similar patterns, though documentation is less comprehensive. The focus during and after the war was on the destruction caused by German bombing, particularly during the Blitz. British defensive measures received positive coverage, emphasising the courage of gun crews and the reassurance provided to the public by active resistance. The secondary effects of British shells falling back on British cities received minimal attention. London had the most extensive air defences of any British city. Anti-aircraft batteries surrounded the capital, creating overlapping zones of fire through which German bombers had to navigate. During intensive periods of the Blitz, these guns fired continuously, launching thousands of shells every night. The fragments from this massive volume of fire fell across the metropolitan area, adding to the destruction from German bombs. British civil defence organisations equipped their personnel with steel helmets, recognising that falling fragments posed significant danger. Wardens patrolling during raids faced threats from multiple directions. German bombs were the primary concern, but fragments from British shells were a constant additional hazard. The distinctive helmets worn by wardens, firefighters, and other civil defence personnel became iconic images of British resilience, though the full range of threats they were designed to protect against was rarely explicitly discussed. Children in British cities collected shell fragments just as their counterparts did elsewhere. British historians and memoirists have documented this behaviour, often presenting it as evidence of youthful resilience and the ability to find normalcy amid chaos. Some accounts note that German bomb fragments were more highly prized than British shell fragments, perhaps because they seemed more directly connected to the enemy. Regardless of preference, the behaviour was ubiquitous and represented the same mixture of fascination, fear, and coping mechanisms seen in other countries. Soviet cities endured the most sustained aerial bombardment and consequently fired the most defensive ammunition. Leningrad, besieged for nearly 900 days, had its anti-aircraft batteries in continuous operation throughout the siege. Moscow, as the political and symbolic heart of the Soviet Union, received massive defensive resources. Stalingrad, during the climactic battle for control of that city, saw anti-aircraft guns used against ground targets as well as aircraft, further multiplying the volume of shells fired. Soviet documentation of civilian casualties from friendly fire is sparse. The priority was defeating Germany, and information that might undermine morale or provide propaganda material to the enemy was suppressed. Personal accounts from survivors provide fragments of the fuller story. Memoirs describe the constant rain of metal during raids, the difficulty of distinguishing between German bombs and Soviet shells, the acceptance that danger came from all directions. One particularly poignant account comes from Leningrad. A survivor recalled how children would dare each other to stand in the open during anti-aircraft barrages, competing to see who could catch or collect the largest fragments. This was presented as a game, a test of courage in a city where death was omnipresent from bombardment, starvation, and disease. The survivor described narrowly avoiding injury multiple times, seeing friends wounded, recognizing in retrospect the desperate absurdity of making entertainment from such danger. It was childhood twisted by circumstances beyond comprehension, finding ways to assert agency in a situation where adults were equally powerless. The Pacific Theatre presented variations on these same themes. Japanese cities faced increasingly heavy American bombing as the war progressed, culminating in the devastating firebomb raids and atomic attacks. Japanese anti-aircraft defences were extensive but less technologically advanced than their European counterparts. They fired enormous quantities of ammunition with limited effect on American bombers flying at high altitude. The shells fell back on Japanese cities already devastated by incendiary bombs, adding a minor but measurable increment to the destruction. American forces in the Pacific also contended with the hazards of their own anti-aircraft fire. Ships at sea had the advantage that most shells fell into water, but those protecting islands or operating near land created the same risks seen in Europe. The battle for Okinawa saw intensive anti-aircraft fire from American ships and shore batteries protecting against kamikaze attacks. Shells that missed their targets fell on the island, sometimes striking American forces or Okinawan civilians. Across all these theatres, certain commonalities emerged. Urban environments suffered more than rural areas because gun placements were concentrated around cities and industrial targets. Dense housing meant that falling debris had more opportunities to strike structures and people. But rural areas were not immune, particularly those beneath approach routes or near isolated targets that attracted defensive fire. Weather influenced the distribution and impact of falling debris. Rain and snow dampened fires started by hot fragments. Wind spread fragments across wider areas. Clear conditions allowed gun crews to fire more accurately, but also meant more shells reaching high altitudes before detonation, giving fragments greater areas to fall across. Fog and clouds reduced visibility, causing crews to fire blindly and increasing the proportion of shells that failed to engage targets. Time of day mattered as well. Nighttime raids were harder to defend against effectively, leading to more shells being fired per bomber engaged. The darkness also meant that civilians had more difficulty seeing and avoiding falling debris. Daytime raids allowed better aimed fire, but also meant more people were outside and exposed rather than sheltering indoors. The cumulative effect of these factors created an environment where civilians in defended cities faced constant multiple threats. Enemy bombs remained the primary danger, capable of causing massive destruction in single incidents. But the secondary threat from defensive fire was persistent, present during every raid, affecting everyone beneath the guns. Over months and years of sustained air warfare, this secondary threat accumulated significant casualties and damage. Attempting to quantify the total impact encounters significant obstacles. Military records focused on enemy aircraft destroyed and damage to military targets. Civilian casualty records often did not distinguish between deaths from enemy action and deaths from friendly fire. Property damage was similarly aggregated without detailed cause analysis except in specific cases like the Netherlands Compensation Fund. Any estimate must therefore be understood as incomplete and likely understated. What can be stated with confidence is that thousands of civilians across multiple countries were killed or injured by their own anti-aircraft defences during World War II. Tens of thousands of structures sustained damage from falling shells and fragments. Agricultural production was disrupted. Infrastructure was damaged. Fire services and civil defence organisations had to divert resources to dealing with threats from friendly fire, rather than focusing exclusively on enemy action. The economic cost was substantial. Manufacturing anti-aircraft ammunition required significant resources and industrial capacity. Shells fired into the air represented consumption of steel, explosives, and labour that might have been directed toward other military needs. When those shells then caused damage on the ground, additional resources were needed for repair and reconstruction. Medical treatment for casualties further strained already overtaxed systems. Compensation funds, where they existed, represented financial obligations that continued for years after the war ended. Beyond economics, the psychological and social costs resist easy measurement. The knowledge that safety required accepting risk from multiple directions created layers of anxiety. Trust in authorities was complicated when defensive measures themselves caused harm. Communities had to develop informal systems for managing these risks, sharing information about dangerous areas, helping each other recover from incidents, supporting families who lost loved ones to what was arguably preventable tragedy. The end of the war did not end the threat. Unexploded ordnance from both enemy and friendly sources littered the landscape across Europe and Asia. Farmers ploughing fields decades after the war still regularly turned up shells. Construction projects encountered buried ordnance. Children playing in areas that had been battlefields sometimes triggered explosions. Specialized teams spent years locating and disposing of the most dangerous items, but the sheer volume made comprehensive clearance impossible. This legacy persists into the present. Unexploded shells from World War II continue to be discovered. Bomb disposal experts continue to be called to construction sites and agricultural areas where someone has uncovered corroded but potentially still dangerous ordnance. Museums display examples of the ammunition that filled the skies so many decades ago. Survivors who remember the war years carry memories of life beneath the steel rain. The historical understanding of this phenomenon has evolved slowly. Immediately after the war, the priority was reconstruction and recovery. Detailed analysis of what had caused different types of damage seemed less important than simply rebuilding. As veterans began writing memoirs and historians began comprehensive studies of the war, attention focused on major campaigns, decisive battles, and the experiences of combat forces. Civilian suffering received less systematic attention, and within that already marginalized topic, the specific issue of casualties from friendly fire was barely mentioned. When anti-aircraft defenses were discussed in historical works, the focus was typically on their effectiveness or lack thereof in protecting against bomber attacks. Debate centered on whether the massive resources devoted to anti-aircraft systems represented good value, whether they actually stopped enough bombers to justify their cost. Some historians argued that anti-aircraft fire had minimal actual impact on bombing campaigns, that most bombers completed their missions despite the defensive barrages. Others pointed to statistical evidence of bombers damaged or destroyed, argued that even missions completed came at higher cost due to defensive fire, and emphasized the psychological impact on bomber crews. What these debates typically omitted was consideration of ground impact. The shells fired by anti-aircraft guns did not disappear into some abstract realm of military statistics. They fell back to earth. They struck people and property. They created a hazard that affected millions of civilians who had no role in deciding that these weapons would be deployed overhead. Including this consideration in the analysis changes the calculation of whether anti-aircraft defenses represented sound policy. A more complete assessment would weigh the number of bombers stopped or turned back against not just the direct costs of the defensive system, but also the casualties and damage inflicted on the defending population. Such an assessment might conclude that in many cases, particularly early in the war when bombing accuracy was poor and individual raids caused limited damage, the defensive fire caused more harm to the defended population than the bombers did. This does not mean that air defense was unnecessary or that populations would have preferred to be undefended, but it does mean that the true cost of these defensive measures was higher than typically acknowledged. Recognizing this adds nuance to how we understand the experiences of civilian populations during the war. They were not merely victims of enemy action. They were also, in a sense, victims of their own defenses. This complicates narratives of pure victimhood or pure resistance. It reveals the ways that total war created impossible situations where every choice carried unacceptable costs, where protection required accepting harm from unexpected sources. The phenomenon also illuminates broader questions about military technology and strategy. Anti-aircraft artillery represented the best available solution to the bomber threat in World War II, but it was an imperfect solution that created its own problems. Later technological developments, particularly guided missiles with proximity fuses and better targeting systems, reduced but did not eliminate these issues. Modern air defense systems are more precise, but they still fire projectiles that must land somewhere, still create debris, still carry the potential for collateral damage. Understanding what happened beneath the flak barrages of World War II provides context for evaluating contemporary military systems. It serves as a reminder that defensive measures, however necessary they may be, are not cost-free. It suggests the importance of considering all consequences, not just the intended military effects when deploying weapons systems in proximity to civilian populations. It reinforces that in warfare, the distinction between combatant and civilian, between threat and protection, between enemy and friendly, can blur in ways that create complex moral and practical challenges. For individuals who lived through this experience, particularly those who were children during the war years, the memories remain vivid. The sound of anti-aircraft guns firing, the whistle of falling shells, the crash and clatter of fragments striking pavement and roofs, these sensory memories persist across decades. So do memories of fear, of uncertainty, of trying to maintain some semblance of normal childhood amid circumstances that were anything but normal. Many carry literal scars, injuries sustained from shell fragments that healed but left permanent marks. Others carry emotional scars, trauma from experiences that were never adequately acknowledged or addressed. The generation that experienced this as children is now largely gone. Each year, fewer survivors remain who can provide first-hand accounts of what it meant to live beneath the steel rain. This makes the historical record increasingly important as the primary means of preserving understanding of this aspect of the war. Yet that historical record remains incomplete and scattered, requiring work to assemble into a comprehensive picture. Archives in multiple countries hold relevant materials. German civil defense records document damage incident by incident. Dutch compensation files provide detailed claims from thousands of affected parties. British civil defense reports mention falling fragments and their effects. Soviet documents, where accessible, contain references to the phenomenon. American military records discuss it in contexts like Pearl Harbor. Personal memoirs and oral histories add individual perspectives. Aggregating all of this material remains a task for historians willing to pursue questions about the full costs of aerial warfare. What emerges from even a partial examination of these sources is a picture of a war that extended beyond the battlefield in ways that affected everyday life profoundly. The home front was not simply a place where people worked in factories and grew victory gardens while waiting for news from distant battle zones. In many locations, the home front was itself a battlefield, though one where the threats came from multiple directions and the traditional military distinction between offense and defense broke down. This challenges some common assumptions about World War II and civilian experience. The narrative of the greatest generation, of populations united in sacrifice and purpose, remains valid. But it requires complication. People endured not just deprivation and fear of the enemy, but also harm from their own forces. They supported the war effort while also coping with the costs that effort imposed directly on them. Unity coexisted with frustration, purpose with exhaustion, sacrifice with resentment at what was being sacrificed. The physical landscape of Europe and Asia still bears traces of this history for those who know how to read them. Buildings constructed or rebuilt after the war sometimes show signs of wartime damage in their foundations or surviving walls. Monuments and memorials commemorate suffering but rarely specify all its sources. Land use patterns reflect clearing and reconstruction made necessary by accumulated destruction from all causes. The steel rain was one contributor among many to the transformation of these landscapes, but its contribution has been inadequately acknowledged. As the war recedes further into history, becoming something that happened beyond living memory, the importance of preserving these complicated truths grows. Simplified narratives of heroism and villainy, of clear distinctions between right and wrong, between friends and enemies, serve certain purposes. They provide moral clarity, making the sacrifices of that generation seem worthwhile and their victories unambiguous. But history is rarely so simple. War creates situations where moral clarity dissolves, where good intentions produce terrible outcomes, where protection and harm become entangled. The steel rain of World War II embodies these complexities. It was a necessary evil that became simply an evil for those it struck. It was technology deployed for protection that wounded the protected. It was a weapon pointed at the sky that killed on the ground. Remembering it, documenting it, understanding it in all its complexity does not diminish the courage of those who fought or the validity of the cause they served. Instead, it provides a more complete and therefore more honest account of what that war meant for millions of people who lived through it. The legacy continues in unexpected ways. Veterans of more recent conflicts have faced similar dilemmas about the use of firepower in populated areas. The rules of engagement, the technologies employed, the specific tactics differ, but the fundamental tension remains between achieving military objectives and minimizing harm to civilians. Understanding that this tension is not new, that previous generations grappled with it and sometimes failed to resolve it satisfactorily, provides valuable perspective for contemporary debates about warfare and its conduct. Education about World War II tends to focus on major battles, key decisions, and the experiences of frontline troops. These remain important subjects worthy of detailed study. But a complete education should also include understanding of how the war affected civilian populations in all its dimensions. That includes acknowledging that the tools of defense sometimes became tools of harm, that the line between protecting and wounding could be disconcertingly thin, that total war created situations where entire populations became targets, whether intentionally or incidentally. The stories of individual victims deserve preservation. The child in Leningrad who played dangerous games with falling fragments. The families in Honolulu who lost loved ones to American shells during the Pearl Harbor attack. The Dutch farmers who watched helplessly as German anti-aircraft fire destroyed their livelihoods. The Berliners who sheltered from British bombs only to be injured by German shells. Each of these represents a human being whose experience of war included betrayal by the weapons meant to keep them safe. At the same time, those who crewed the anti-aircraft guns were themselves victims of circumstance. They were following orders, doing their duty, trying to protect their homes and families. They did not intend the harm their weapons caused on the ground. The fault, if fault is to be assigned, lies not with individuals, but with the nature of the technology and the strategic situation that made its use seem necessary. This, too, is part of the complexity that must be preserved in the historical record. The phenomenon of the steel rain ultimately reveals fundamental truths about the nature of modern warfare. Industrial age conflict mobilizes entire societies and puts entire populations at risk. The distinction between battlefield and home front collapses when bombers can strike anywhere and defenses extend over entire countries. Technology allows destruction on unprecedented scales, but also creates unintended consequences that multiply the harm done. In such circumstances, no one emerges unscathed, no place remains truly safe, no measure of protection is without cost. These truths remain relevant. Aerial warfare continues, with technologies far more sophisticated than those available in World War II. Populations still live beneath systems designed to protect them, systems that in the event of their use will fill the sky with projectiles and debris that must come down somewhere. The specific mechanisms have changed, but the underlying physics and the fundamental dilemmas persist. Learning from the experience of those who lived through the steel rain might inform better approaches to these enduring challenges. The dead cannot speak for themselves, but the historical record can speak for them if properly assembled and honestly interpreted. The thousands who died from falling shells and fragments, the tens of thousands who were injured, the hundreds of thousands whose property was damaged, all deserve acknowledgement. Their experience was part of the war as much as any battle or campaign, and excluding it from historical understanding means presenting an incomplete and therefore false picture of what that war was. For all these reasons, the phenomenon of anti-aircraft defences causing civilian casualties deserves more attention than it has received. It should be integrated into comprehensive histories of World War II. It should be taught alongside accounts of strategic bombing and air defence tactics. It should inform analysis of how civilian populations experienced total war. It should be remembered as part of the full and complicated truth about a conflict that shaped the modern world. The skies above Europe and Asia during those years were filled with violence, with bombers and fighters and bursting shells creating a realm of terror far above the earth. But that terror did not remain aloft. It fell back down, carried by gravity and physics, returning to strike the ground in forms both intended and unintended. The steel rain was as much a part of the air war as the battles fought at altitude, and its effects on those below were as significant as any bombing raid. This truth has been obscured for too long. Bringing it fully into historical consciousness serves both the memory of those who suffered it and the understanding of those who study the war today.